We're going to start off our evolution unit talking about adaptations. Our science and engineering practices for this lesson include constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And our cross-cutting concepts include patterns, cause and effect, and structure and function. So let's get into it. What is an adaptation? All organisms are adapted to life in general, such as having legs for walking, wings for flying, or leaves for going through photosynthesis. These are termed general adaptations. Organisms also have specific adaptations that allow them to survive in their specific environments. Specific adaptations are special features or behaviors that have evolved to make an organism particularly suited to its environmental niche. Remember that a niche is the position and role of an organism within its ecosystem. It includes both the biotic and abiotic factors of that particular organism. So talking about a shark, looking at specific and general adaptations, we have general adaptations that include fins provide stability, power, and control. Gills have a large surface area that allow for them to absorb as much oxygen as possible. And they're also streamlined in shape to reduce friction as they move through the water. Specific adaptations for the shark include specialized sense organs to detect other organisms, sharp teeth that are consistently replaced, highly sensitive sense of smell for detecting blood, and a silver-colored underbelly that allows for camouflage. Some adaptations are physical, such as the shape of a bird's beak or the size of plant leaves. These are structural adaptations. Other structural adaptations include fur thickness, body shape, teeth size and shape, and internal organization such as muscle structure. Organisms also exhibit behavioral adaptations. These are activities that an organism does to help survive. They might include searching for food, hibernation during the winter, interacting as a herd of animals instead of just a single organism, or vocalizations in order to communicate with others of the same species. Behavioral adaptations can be learned or they can be inherited. Inherited behavior is instinctive and genetic. Learned behavior must first be taught or learned from experience. Functional adaptations. Adaptations relating to a feature or a group of features that allow an organism to perform a specific function are called functional adaptations. For example, making slime, controlling body temperature, and secreting poison are all functional adaptations of certain types of tropical frogs. Some of those frogs have poisonous skin that can make predators very ill or even cause them to die. Functional adaptations aid the survival of an individual. They are controlled by genes, so these things can be passed down from generation to generation. So why is adaptation important? The better adapted an organism is to its habitat, the more successful it will be when competing for resources, such as food or finding mates. This increases the organism's chance of survival and therefore its chance of reproducing and passing on those genes that allowed it to be successful in the first place. So let's go through some true or false statements about adaptation. Some adaptations are highly specialized. That is true. The better adapted an organism is to its habitat, the more competitive it will be. That is also true. Animals are the only organisms that are adapted to their habitat. That's false. Many different organisms have specialized adapted features that allow them to be successful in their habitat. Functional adaptations must be learned or taught. This is false. Different organisms can have similar adaptations. That is true. And adaptations evolve through the process of natural selection. This is also true. So talking a little bit about predator and prey. A predator is an animal that hunts and kills other animals for food. They can either be carnivores or omnivores. As a reminder, carnivores are organisms that only eat meat. So for example, the wolf. Omnivores are organisms that eat meat and vegetation. We are an example of an omnivore. A prey animal is one that is attacked and eaten by a predator. Prey often live in groups for protection. So what adaptations do you think predators and prey will have? Some of the adaptations that are common to predators, to prey, or to both include the following. Predators oftentimes have adaptation of sharp teeth, claws, or beaks, and an ability to judge size and distance very well. Prey oftentimes have a wide field of view. This is important for seeing predators. Oftentimes they live in groups for protection and have the ability to sting, poison, or some form of defense mechanism. Both predators and prey have excellent vision. Oftentimes they are camouflage, and they also have the ability to have high speeds for either defense purposes or to catch their prey. So specifically looking at adaptations of one particular organism, this is the lynx, and they are specifically adapted to catching snowshoe hares. Some of their adaptations include warm, thick, furry coats that allow them to be protected from the cold. They have very strong hind leg muscles that allow them to pounce great distances, up to 6.5 meters. They have extra large paws that allow for them to stay on top of snow very well. They almost act like snowshoes. They have sharp teeth and claws for puncturing flesh. And they have excellent binocular vision for judging distances. So are these structural or behavioral adaptations? These are all structural adaptations. Adaptations of brown bears. So how are brown bears adapted to survival in the forests of North America? Some of their adaptations include thick fur for insulation, strong arms to defend themselves from other predators or to dig for food in their environment. They have claws that allow them to easily catch fish. And they also hibernate during the winter to survive when food is scarce. Some organisms exhibit mimicry. These organisms are oftentimes harmless, but they've become adapted to look like a dangerous species. For example, stingless hoverflies have black and yellow bands on their body that resemble those on wasps or bees. This warns predators to stay away, even though the hoverfly has zero ability of stinging. They are mimicking a characteristic of an organism that does have that ability. Some organisms live in extreme environments. So, for example, some environments might have extremely high levels of salt. They may have really high or really low temperatures, or really high or low pressures in the environment in which they live. These organisms are known as extremophiles. They live in extreme environments. Deep in the ocean, there are hydrothermal vents. There is heated seawater escaping from cracks in the Earth's crust. This environment has extremely high temperatures, high pressures, and no sunlight. And despite this fact, there are organisms that live there. Some organisms have adapted to survive these extreme conditions. One example are giant tube worms, as we see in this image, and they survive by feeding on nutrients that are produced by bacteria living inside them. Those bacteria absorb some of the nutrients that are being released by the hydrothermal vents. They break down those chemicals into a form that is usable by the tube worms. And therefore, these organisms can survive in that extreme environment. So looking at the polar bear. Polar bears have a number of adaptations that allow them to survive in the Arctic. They have feet that are large and wide that allow the bear to distribute its weight over snow or over ice. And they have extremely thick fur for insulation, sharp claws to prey on the prey that they are after, and have the ability to remove meat. They have strong legs for running and swimming. Their fur is greasy to repel water, and it's also white to camouflage them in the snow that allows them to sneak up on their prey. That fur is also very thick and allows for insulation from the cold. They have a small body surface area to prevent heat loss and a thick layer of fat to insulate them from the cold. They have small ears to reduce surface area and prevent heat loss. They have eyes on the front of their head to judge distance and speed. They also have brown irises, which reduce the glare from the sun reflecting off of the snow. And finally, they have sharp teeth to kill prey and rip apart meat. Animals in different environments have adaptations that allow them to live comfortably in the climate and the environmental conditions of the region that they live in. And so we're going to create an animal adapted to extreme desert conditions. So we're going to press on the adaptations that would be useful to an animal in a desert habitat. Well, I think probably the first important thing would be adapted for living at night, because temperatures are going to be reduced in those desert habitats during the nighttime versus the daytime. The desert is hot during the day, so being able to move around at night will increase survival. I think having thick lips may be important as well, comparative to having no eyelids, because I think of things like dust storms And I think having the ability to really close your eyes and your lips is going to be important. Also, things like cacti in the desert environment are extremely hard to eat. And so having those thick lips would allow for the animal to eat food in its environment a little bit better. Having a large body or a small body? Well, I know that large bodies allow organisms to absorb heat at a slower rate than smaller bodies. And so it might be important to have a larger body in order to decrease the rate of heat absorption. I don't know that having web feet is going to be any advantage in this ecosystem, but having wide feet might. These will distribute an animal's weight more evenly and prevent it from sinking into the sand. I also think that it might be useful to have nostrils that close. This would prevent sand from entering nostril or nasal passages. In this case, this is starting to look an awful lot like a camel, and I know camels have humps. Humps contain large fat reserves, which enable an animal to survive a long time without food or water. And then, I don't know that antlers are going to benefit this organism in this environment, but hairy ears would be really useful to stop sand and dust from entering those structures during sandstorms. So there we've successfully created an animal that is likely to survive in a desert environment based on these structural characteristics that we identified. Microorganisms also have adaptations. Microorganisms have a range of adaptations to enable them to live in a variety of conditions. For example, thermophiles are able to survive at very high temperatures, such as those found in deep sea hydrothermal vents. Psychrophiles can survive at very low temperatures, such as those temperatures found in the Arctic. Other microorganisms are adapted to salty habitats, acidic conditions or environments with very low nutrient levels. So they've got specific characteristics that allow them to survive in the environment that they survive in. Plants also have adaptations. Individual plants cannot move to a more suitable environment. So it's important that they're adapted to the environment in which they live in. The exchange of gases and water with the surroundings can be altered in order for a plant to adapt to changing environments. This is done through these structures called guard cells, which alter the size of the stomata. So in this image, the guard cell is on the outside, and the stomata is the opening that's allowing for gas exchange. During drought, the stomata remain closed in order to conserve water. When there is plenty of water and lots of sunlight, these stoma will open up by the guard cells expanding, and gas exchange and water exchange can take place. So how is a cactus adapted to its specific environment? To specifically that very hot, dry climate in which they live. Water is stored in a fleshy stem, and they have a thick, waxy cuticle that helps to reduce water loss. Their leaves are narrow spines to reduce water loss. If their leaves were broad and flat, like many of the leaves on the deciduous trees where we live, they would exchange a lot more water with the environment. So having narrow spines helps to reduce that water loss. A rounded shape means that the surface area to volume ratio is very low. This also reduces water loss. The stomata open at night to minimize that water loss. And roots are very deep or they're very shallow and widespread to catch as much surface water as possible. A very deep root is called a taproot, and oftentimes they can go extremely deep into the soil to find water. So what do flowers do? Flowers enable plants to reproduce sexually. For this to happen, pollen from the male part of the flower must be carried to the female part of the flower. This is called pollination. In what ways can pollination take place? Pollen can be carried by insects from one flower to another, or pollen can be blown by the wind from one flower to another. So those of you that have allergies to pollen, you have an allergy to the sexually reoccurring parts of the plant. Adaptations for insect pollination. How are flowers adapted for pollination by insects, such as bees and butterflies? The nectar that is produced is often a source of food for insects, and it's deep within the flower itself. Large sticky pollen grains become attached to the insect's body when it lands on that portion of the flower. Oftentimes there are colorful scented petals that attract insects to the reproductive parts of the flower. And there are also stiff anthers and stigmas that are positioned where the insect must brush past them as it enters the flower. Adaptations for wind pollination. So how are flowers adapted for pollination by wind? Oftentimes they are small, dull-colored petals. They have huge numbers of light, tiny pollen grains that can easily be blown in the wind. There's oftentimes long, feathery stigma hanging outside of the flower so pollen can be trapped as it blows by. And the anthers hang loosely outside of the flower so wind can blow the pollen. There are also a number of unusual plant adaptations. Plants can live in acidic or waterlogged soils where there is very little nitrates. Some plants have evolved a rather cunning adaptation to obtain the nutrients they need. For example, pitcher plants have large hollowed leaves filled with fluid. These large hollow leaves that are filled with fluid trap insects and other small organisms that may fall into them. Hairs on the slippery side of the plant are angled down to ensure that the victim does not escape, and the plant digests its victims to absorb the nitrates it needs. So we've now learned about a number of adaptations of animals and plants. We will continue on with more information in this topic of evolution as we explore additional lessons.